You have the entire cabinet. You mentioned no guardrails anymore, Susan, but you have the Secretary of State, Attorney General Bill Barr investigating the origins of the Russia investigation, Vice President Pence being called for documents. We see cabinet members this week being pulled into this wave. Let's hear from a couple of them.
As for was I on the phone call, I was on the phone call.
And he tasked me to go and to meet with the president of Ukraine and carry our concerns about those issues. And anyone that looks at the president's transcript will see that the president was raising issues that were appropriate, that were of genuine interest to the American people.
Tim, you wrote the best-selling book, American Carnage, about how the Republican Party became controlled by President Trump. When you see these leaders in the cabinet advocating for the president's position on foreign policy in Ukraine, what does it tell you?
Geez, it tells us a lot of things, Bob. I think first and foremost, what it tells you is that everyone within the inner orbit, certainly, of the president, and really even within his outer orbit, they understand that if you are going to cross this president, if you are going to go to the mattresses with him, you're going to lose, right? There is very little incentive for anyone in his inner circle, anybody in the West Wing, anybody in the administration of any authority or influence, to go toe-to-toe with him and to try and talk him down, much less to even just give him news that he doesn't want to hear, right? To try and dissuade him, to try and sort of buffer him from his own worst instincts, as Jim Mattis and H.R. McMaster and Rex Tillerson and others tried so famously to do and largely failed to do. There is just no compelling reason for anyone, whether it's Rudy Giuliani or Mick Mulvaney or anybody else, to tell the president that what he's doing is wrong, strategically or otherwise. And the result of that is a president who feels as though, to your point a minute ago, Bob, there are no guardrails. There is no envelope to push here. He is just sort of on his own, and nobody seems to be telling him that he can't do what he's doing.
But we did see Kurt Volker this week, the envoy to Ukraine, who's now left. He did tell Rudy Giuliani that some of these conspiracy theories about corruption in Ukraine or different views were not credible.
Right. I mean, you saw in those text messages how Kurt Volker was kind of caught in the middle of both trying to mitigate what Giuliani was doing and saying and dissuade him, but when that failed, being the go-between because he wanted to preserve some sort of relationship between Trump and the Ukrainian president, because the alternative is that you disadvantage Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia because there's an actual war and an occupation going on over there. But Volker's not in an elected office. He is a former McCain guy, and he kind of is in that school of thought about how foreign policy should be done. And when he was called to testify before or be deposed before these House committees, he resigned his post as special envoy. There's not that many Volkers in there, and there's not that many Volkers that are sitting in Congress right now. So the question is, as Tim was putting out, they've kind of become used to this process of seeing the president just do and do and do and say, tell me it's wrong, you're not telling me it's wrong. It would have to be, I don't know where exactly the line is because so many members of Congress have been defending so much where they might break in this process. You've seen people like Mitt Romney do it, but you haven't seen that many more people join that chorus.
But I don't think the president probably loses support among Republican members of Congress until he loses support among Republican voters across the country. Right. And one of the things we found in a new USA Today episode we did this week was that the president still has the support of Republicans. Republicans oppose impeaching the president. But there were a couple red flags, I thought, for the president in the findings. One is that 30% of Republicans said it was an abuse of power for a president to pressure the president of another country to help him investigate a political rival. 30%. That's not nothing. 80% of Republicans said the president is not above the law. That is a higher number than for either Democrats or independents.
Looking at that data, Peter, why does Vice President Pence, we saw the video, remain in such lockstep with President Trump? Same with Secretary of State Pompeo. What is their positioning?
Well, I think it's partly what Tim talked about. Republicans at this point have learned that crossing the president didn't pay for Rex Tillerson or Jim Mattis or any of these others who tried to restrain him. And so the current crop, the current people around him are not, in fact, the Committee to Save America that the first generation of aides were. These are the people who've decided to be there to help him and enable him and perhaps steer him if they can. But Mick Mulvaney is the chief of staff. He is in his 10th month as acting chief of staff. He doesn't even have the full title. Doesn't require Senate confirmation. Has nothing to do with that. It's just the president doesn't want to give him the full title. That is emasculating for anybody. It makes it very hard for anybody to do your job if you don't even have the full title behind you.
You know, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Paul Ryan, the former House Speaker, just after he'd retired. This is maybe 3 weeks after he had left office. And he was describing to me how in the first year he was president, that Donald Trump really seemed to respond to a Jim Mattis or a Rex Tillerson or an H.R. McMaster or even a Reince Priebus once in a while who would push back on him, who would attempt to say, Mr. President, here's the line, here's how far up, how close you can get to that line, but you can't go over it. And Ryan described to me this sort of gradual evolution where sort of month by month on the job, the president began to become more comfortable with pushing up next to that line and then crossing it. And then when he would realize that there was really no consequence for crossing it, he would continue to cross it. And eventually he got to a point where he just stopped listening altogether. And when you get to that point, I think that's where we are now, and we're probably even well beyond it.
And it's not just he's not listening to cabinet members, he's listening to new people outside, like Rudy Giuliani. The ascent of Giuliani is part of this story.
It definitely is, and Giuliani also kind of has this devil-may-care attitude where he's leaned into what he believes is what he thinks is advantageous and politically correct, and isn't really letting anybody stop him. He also goes out on television and makes statements that seem to advance the case against the president, except that it isn't really changing where the pendulum is swinging in terms of where the political line is between who supports and who criticizes the president. And at the end of the day, I know that you were quoting the statistics that the president is not above the law, and 80% of the Republican Party thinks that. This is not going to be decided in a court of law. We are talking about legal procedures. We are talking about legal arguments, but we're also talking about squishing it all into just a few months. This is a political process fundamentally, and the arguments that both sides are making at the end of the day are going to depend on that.